America's darkest hour, battling the second great insurrection. And I start out by asking, have you noticed how Republicans rarely talk about issues? I mean, I remember a time in American politics when we used to have actual public debates about whether, trickle-down economics would actually work, whether, the proper role of government was to provide housing for poor people, what kind of level of funding food stamps should be at, things like that. And Republicans just don't engage in these topics any longer. They just, they have no interest in it. I mean, they complain about the state of the economy, but they have no recommendations other than, more tax cuts for billionaires. They rant about brown people pouring over the southern border, but they refuse to discuss what can be done about it. In fact, when the Senate actually came up with a solution, the Republicans in the House shot it down at Donald Trump's request. The only solution that they're offering is a Nazi-like roundup of 11 million people and concentration camps to hold them. They whine that our students aren't doing well, but they refuse to engage in any kind of serious discussion about how to take us back to an era when America had the newest and most successful public education system in the world. They yell about prescription drug prices and the high cost of insurance, but their only policy suggestion is to end Obamacare and Medicaid. And they love to slander BLM in big cities with large black populations, but they refuse to even entertain a conversation about the racial divide in this country. Instead, they're trying to outlaw and decertify black history classes. I shared with you yesterday the story of what they just did in South Carolina, decertifying the black history classes in that state. So why is this? Well, I believe the reason is that the Republican Party is now a post-politics party. They're really, frankly, no longer interested in politics. What they want is power. And they have a model on which they are basing where they are going forward, what they are doing. And it's a model that actually existed in the United States between 1820 and 1865. And it was called the Confederacy. When the cotton gin, it was originally invented actually in 1797. But Eli Whitney didn't get funding to roll it out and make it a product until around 1805. And one cotton gin could clean the same amount of cotton as 50 enslaved people in the same period of time. And it was a very expensive machine. They were handmade. So when the cotton gin came out, the wealthiest of the slaveholding plantations in the South bought them. And suddenly they could just massively outcompete all the smaller farms around them, and which they did. And just, and they engaged in this massive regional price fixing program and basically ran all the small cotton farmers out of business, put them into bankruptcy, bought their farms from them, turned them into sharecroppers. And by the 1830s, basically, the South had ceased to be anything resembling a democracy. It had become a complete oligarchy that was controlled by a handful of very, very wealthy families in each one of the Confederate states. And they tolerated absolutely no opposition. This was certainly by the 1840s. White men who dared to run or vote against them, and by the way, they looked at your vote. There was no secret ballot then, were often assassinated or lynched. Newspapers were seized and handed over to oligarchs friendly to the plantation owners. Elections became a mere charade. They even monitored the mail. If you dared send somebody a letter complaining about one of the Southern politicians, you'd find yourself in prison or hanged from a tree. By the 1850s, democracy in the South was completely dead. The Confederacy had become a police state. And then they reached out and tried to end that pesky remnant of democracy in the North as well. This is from a speech in 1864 by Illinois Representative John Farnsworth on the floor of the House of Representatives. He said, with the invention of the cotton gin, the greed for power took possession of the slaveholders, and the avarice of these men overleaped itself. Then it was, Mr. Speaker, that the slave power got the control of the government, of the executive, legislative, and judicial departments. Then it was that they got possession of the high places of society. They took possession of the churches. They took possession of the lands. Then it became criminal for a man to open his lips in denunciation of them. Then followed the throttling of the right to petition, suppressing the freedom of the press, the suppression of the freedom of the mails. All these things followed the taking possession of the government and lands by the slave power until we were the slaves of slaves, being chained to the car of this slave juggernaut. End quote. This is the model that today's Republican Party is using. In fact, I think you could call the modern GOP a reinvented confederacy, or the reinvented confederacy. And they're not even bashful about it. This is why 10 Republican-controlled states officially commemorate the Confederacy with state holidays every year, and 6 states still refuse to recognize Juneteenth: Florida, Mississippi, Alabama, Arkansas, South Carolina, and North Carolina. What do these states have in common? They're all former Confederate states. And I would argue that they are the new Confederacy. I mean, you know, Reagan's massive tax cuts and of course, you know, Bush's and Trump's had essentially the same oligarch-producing impact as the cotton gin did back in 1805. Before Reagan, you know, we had maybe 3 or 4 billionaires in the United States. I mean, they were few and far between, and they weren't politically active. They were just busy making money. Today, right-wing billionaires own our Congress, they own our social media, they own our news media, and they own the Supreme Court. The billionaire-funded Project 2025 is this generation's version of John C. Calhoun's nullification speech and South Carolina's secession proclamation. In this brave new world run by Citizen Trump and the MAGA GOP, slave labor has been replaced by perpetual poverty and a $7.25 minimum wage, and red state laws that are hostile to unions. Children are being encouraged to go into the workplace, even in places like slaughterhouses, rather than going to school. Quality education becomes exclusively the province of the rich and white, as public schools are gutted by voucher programs while college tuition explodes. Healthcare is a luxury only available to the wealthy as insurance becomes unaffordable. Republican governors refuse to expand Medicaid, and medical practices are being bought up by hedge funds all across the country and turned into concierge practices where you have to pay $3,000 a year just to have access to your doctor. Media that speaks truth to power are bankrupted by new libel laws taken over and turned into Republican propaganda machines. Women, people of color, and religious minorities are made culturally and legally subordinate to white Christian men. And in any Republican-controlled part of the country where there's even a chance that a Democrat can win an election, the voter rolls are purged of Democrats, and those voters who survive the purges find increasingly complicated barriers to vote. And, of course, they want to preserve the Confederate names and monuments and bring back the monuments that have been removed. You know, as we saw on January 6th, the Confederate flag is one of their favorite totems. The new GOP motto might as well be, we don't need no stinking issues. We just want power and revenge for the heroes of the Old South and the new insurrection. This is why they lie so easily on Sunday talk shows and in political campaigns. They don't give a damn about issues. All they care about is power. And their base is with them. They, you know, if there were Bad Choices newsletter, our Oliver Marcus Malloy writing, you know, MAGA dumb bleeps are so bleeping dumb, they have no idea that the pro-slavery Confederates were the bad guys. In fact, they know what the sides were in the Civil War, and they're intentionally embracing the Confederacy. We gotta realize, finally, and Democrats need to figure this out, that we're no longer engaged in issue combat. This isn't a debate about whether trickle-down works or not. This isn't a debate about, you know, whether we should have Section 9 housing. This isn't a debate about, you know, how expansive food stamp programs should be or what level of income you should have in order to qualify for Obamacare. This is now about the Republican Party trying to seize absolute political and economic power to end our democracy and reinvent the Confederacy. And only when we start having that conversation, only when we fully realize that's what this is about. In fact, I think that the reason that the 6 conservatives on the Supreme Court went along with the bump stocks is at least 2 of them are anticipating a second civil war, and they want their side to be as well armed as possible. So, we've got to figure this out. Democrats need to figure this out. This isn't about issues anymore. Republicans, Trump, the right in general, they don't give a damn about issues. They only care about raw, naked power and tearing down America, the same way the Confederacy tried to tear down America. They tried to end democracy in the United States. They tried to impose their oligarchy, their fascist oligarchy, on the rest of this country. And now we've got, some 40% of the population that still thinks that's cool. We just need to be honest about this. Which raises the question, exactly how do we deal with it? If you have thoughts on that, I'd love to hear them. I'll be picking up your calls in a little while. Stay with us.